Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We're in the middle of an exceptional political season. Our country is facing acute and deepening problems, and simultaneously, there is an open rebellion in both the political parties against the establishment. What is happening and where are we going? How well prepared are our leaders to address the pressing issues of the day? The American people seem to want change, but what kind of change? Does morality and goodness have any role to play? To answer these questions, we are very pleased to have Claes, who is professor of politics at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and the editor of the academic journal Humanitas, which we will discuss today. Our viewers should know that our guest today, Claes, was born and raised in Sweden and has written 7 books and taught at the University of Virginia and Georgetown University. The current special edition of Humanitas contains a symposium on the meaning of morality in politics. Also, without mentioning Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, this issue of Humanitas covers morality and politics. Professor Wren, what does morality have to do with politics?
Everything. A lot of people say that it has very little to do with it, but that depends, I think, on how you understand it.
Well, that's just it, the definition of morality. Has the consensus broken down about what is right and wrong in American society? And if so, does it matter?
It matters greatly, and I think it has broken down. You don't have the kind of consensus underlying various divisions that the framers of the Constitution were counting on. I mean, they set up a system that put a premium on finding the common ground. You didn't have to be suspicious of the deeper motives of your opponents. You could always return to something you have in common. That's no longer the case.
Well, wasn't it the overarching Christian belief that of right and wrong? Has that changed in our country?
Yes, it certainly has changed as America has drifted away from its origins. The origins of America and of the Constitution are classical, they're Roman, they are Christian, they are British,
yes,
and of course they are distinctive American elements. But that kind of consensus, that tradition has slowly but surely faded.
Well, let's talk about some of the philosophers, because in your journal you talk about all these various philosophers, and I thought it was interesting, Rousseau, you talk about Rousseau talks about morality and virtue, and is he relevant to your argument?
He is highly relevant, but you need to understand that Rousseau is, shall we call him, the great radical with reference to the Western tradition.
Well, let's give our viewers a sense of history. He lived in France. He had a great impact during the French Revolution, or before that?
Well, he's widely, and I think justly, regarded as the intellectual father of the French Revolution of 1789, which was all about radically overturning the established order.
And
the way he
the
did
monarchy.
it, and the monarchy,
yes.
Yes. And the way he did it was to refashion the way people thought about morality specifically.
Okay.
It used to be that to be moral meant to be a person of character. By their fruits you shall know them.
Yes.
Those are well-known words. Well, that meant by their fruits in action you will know who they are, good or bad.
Okay.
For Rousseau, morality became a matter of emotion, feeling pity. And you could sum up what his morality amounted to by saying, you've heard the phrase, daring to share that you care. It's squeezing a tear out of the corner of your eye when you see people suffering. That makes you good and noble. From the point of view of the older Western tradition, that sort of sentiment is irrelevant from the point of view of judging what kind of a morality a person has.
Because a person instead should, rather than crying, should take action and help the poor, right?
Yeah, loving neighbor.
Yeah, be a loving...
How quaint.
Exactly. Well, now, what is your definition of a citizen, and what is the citizen's responsibility to its government?
Well, a citizen is one who has some share in ruling the country of which he is a part.
Right.
Most of the time he may be merely a voter, but there's no reason in principle why he could not fill other roles and become a ruler. But this is something that's very much a part of the American constitutional tradition. To be qualified to rule others, you must be able to rule yourself, first of all. So that the self-restraint that the Constitution is, or the constitutional restraint that the Constitution is about, presupposes that you have lots of people around who have character and who are capable of ruling themselves.
So these are people that, of course, pay their bills and do not lie and do not murder their neighbors, right? I mean, so you're talking about responsible citizens, right?
Yeah, responsible citizenship. Everybody knows there's probably apocryphal story about Benjamin Franklin being asked at the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. A woman asked him this, well, what have you given us?
Yes.
And he said, a republic, if you can keep it.
Yes.
And people wonder, well, why wouldn't we be able to keep it? Because the Constitution assumes that people will be responsible. They will not misuse freedom. Okay. They will not misuse power, but they will be on their best behavior, and that will keep the Constitution alive.
Well, we were doing well for a couple of centuries, right? And now, most Americans believe that equality and liberty go hand in hand. I mean, traditional conservative thinkers such as Wilmar Kendall and Russell Kirk have written that there is a tension between these two principles. Would you agree?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that liberty, like freedom, is a term with an infinite number of different meanings.
Okay.
The word liberalism has become useless.
Yeah, because no one knows what that means.
No, it could mean anything under the sun. Same with God or virtue. I mean, we're living in a shambles, so you have to be careful defining your terms.
Okay.
If you look at the people who conceived the Constitution, for example, it was taken for granted that freedom depends upon a certain element of inner restraint.
Okay.
People will be on their best behavior. If they're not, freedom is going to be used for some pernicious purpose, and that will eventually erode liberty. And you can't have constitutionalism if people are behaving that way.
But what about equality? How does that play?
Well, first of all, equality is a principle of mathematics. In the real world, there's nothing
that's equal, right?
No. Have you ever found anything that's equal? I've never found two equal human beings. They're all different in countless different ways. Now, we have this principle of equality before the law. It means that we're supposed to be treated the same.
Right.
But to do justice, you have to actually take into account that people are different. So you have murder of the first degree, second degree, you have manslaughter. You have to do justice in the specific case. Right. And I would argue that morality is similar in that you have to be able to do what you think, using your best understanding, is right in these circumstances.
I see.
That is, universal principles, they're abstract, but they have very limited utility when you're thinking about what to do here and now.
So something that was moral in 1850 would not be moral today. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's possible in
Okay.
some respects.
Yes, it changes because society has changed. The term morality changes.
Well, take an example. If you steal somebody's water in desert areas, that's a serious crime.
Yes.
Does it occur to anybody to say that you stole my water here in the United States?
No.
Water is plentiful.
Yes.
So the right thing will have to vary depending upon your situation.
Exactly. Well, Aristotle taught that the relationship between men and women would determine the nature of the regime. Does that apply now, and how does it apply to the United States today?
That's a complex question.
It is.
What he had in mind when he was talking about the relationship between men and women was that they are really in charge of bringing up future citizens.
Okay.
Now, we could spend a long time talking about how he, shall we say, downgraded women. But I'm not sure that that's what you wanted to talk about.
No. Well, of course, there are so many things regarding the political world I want to get to, but I also feel a peaceful society. I think we all want that. And so how do wars come about in your mind?
Oh, in any number of different ways. And some of the wars are, shall we say, unnecessary. Or they have very dubious sources. Now, something that the framers of the Constitution always worried about is the will to power.
Yes.
It seems to be a very deep-seated human trait that you want to dominate others. You want them to defer to you. And so people want to exercise power.
That's right.
But they can't say to others, hey, I want to dominate you. No, they dress up this will to power by saying, I want wonderful things for you. How about freedom and democracy? You really should have it. You need it. You crave it.
Yes. Yes.
And, oh, you don't want it? Well, let us help you. And so you may even invade a country.
Right.
In order to give them these wonderful things. What you really want deep down may be something entirely different, namely to dominate for its own sake.
Well, I wondered if you'd read about this new book called The Confessions of Congressman X, who wrote that the two main jobs of a member of Congress are one, keep the job, and two, raise money to get reelected. Those are the two main jobs.
Well, you hear that everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what congressmen themselves...
It's depressing.
Yes, it's depressing.
How can you change? How can that be changed? It seems like the constituency needs, or the culture needs to change, right?
Everything begins in the culture. I think one could argue that something has snapped in American culture and that we are seeing a precipitous decline of standards. There was a time when people in the Senate, let's say, would genuinely believe it when they addressed themselves as the learned gentleman from Massachusetts.
Right. Yes.
They were sort of giving the opponent a good name, hoping that he would rise to meet the standard. But increasingly, people recognize that that person has just the wrong motives. It's not just that he's wrong on the policy, hasn't gotten things just right, but that person wants to defeat me, crush me. And in that kind of an environment, politics becomes increasingly what it always threatens to become, but war. And you need to have the resources to fight those other people.
They're not being cooperative. Everyone is opposing each other.
A whole lot of this fighting that the journalists make so much about is more or less for show. The people who demand change don't really want all that much of it.
That's right, that's right. What do you think about America's vanishing middle class? I mean, what can be done to bring it back?
Well, that's a matter of economics to a great extent, but I think it's also a matter of understanding something that Aristotle, the great Greek ancient philosopher, argued. He said that it's a very serious matter if you get too wide a divergence between the very rich and the poor. And he said the best possible situation for any polity is to have a large middle class. Preferably the middle class ought to be bigger than the poor and the rich together.
And we used to have that in this country.
Yes.
We used to have that. And in the last 20 years, it's disappeared.
And I think one of the subjects that I'm certain that future economists will be studying pretty closely is how this enormous transfer of wealth took place. I think they're going to find the key in the enormous indebtedness of Americans. There's public debt. You all know we're moving fast toward $20 trillion.
And that's hard to comprehend.
But then you have private debt.
Yes. Credit card debt.
Yes. Americans are spending way beyond their means, money they don't have.
Right.
And we're always thinking about new things to spend money on.
And of course, we're encouraged to do that by the television advertising and all the advertising around us. It's just pushing us to.
But my point is that I think the future economists are likely to find that the key to how society became more polarized between the poor and the rich is the money that is being made off of this indebtedness.
Yes.
And there's something, there's an entire dynamic, political, financial dynamic that leads to more and more of this. To us, it seems horrendous to have a $20 trillion debt, but to some others, it may look otherwise.
Now, what about, I mean, how can conservatives change the culture? I mean, it seems to me that we used to have a lot more debate and more, it seems now there's neocons, there's the traditional conservatives, there's the liberal conservatives. I mean, there's so many different types of conservative.
Well, first of all, so-called conservatives have to understand, and it's very, very late, that the key to changing a society is not politics. Politics is important. I'm a professor of politics. I don't consider it insignificant.
Right.
But you can understand what's going to happen in politics only by looking at the culture, looking specifically at the universities.
Okay.
You find out what is being taught, what is in at Harvard and Duke and Princeton and Stanford, and you will know what's going to be in among the talk show hosts and the politicians and the script writers and so on. And they change the underlying momentum of a society.
Well, what are some, like, 3 in themes right now? You're at the university. What are people talking about that are in?
Well, I'm not at the most typical university. I'm at the Catholic University of America. But I think that, well, I'm not going to refer to specific schools, postmodernism or anything like that. But I think that underlying so much of what is happening in Western civilization and the United States is this desire for liberation, to be able to live out all of your desires without consequences.
Okay.
I think it has to do also with getting rid of something that was pretty problematic in the old days, namely a nagging conscience. Okay. You know, if you did certain things, you'd feel badly about it, maybe for years.
Yes.
And so I think that much of postmodernism or postmodernism and such movements have to do with making people feel more comfortable doing what they would love to do.
And not having any regrets, right? No regrets. Yeah. That's right. Well, society has gotten so much more technological. So how does that have an impact on government? I mean, it's technocratic, and everyone's got their
well,
smartphones.
You're bringing up a huge subject, but one aspect of that development that strikes me as significant is that our attention span is shrinking, shrinking. You know, sometimes I will go to lunch with somebody and the person will be fiddling with
their phone the whole time, right?
With the phone. And where do people get their news? Well, it's going to be snippets on Facebook or something like this.
Yes, yes.
That is, people are becoming
addicted to their phones, aren't they?
Well, not only that, but they're becoming more and more superficial. There used to be an expression especially in Europe, Bildung. It's a German word for acquiring a certain breadth and depth. You would know something about music and philosophy. You would be a fully fledged human being, ready for life. Well, we are being pulled into something rather superficial, which is also, it seems, the lowest common denominator.
So people don't have time to read. People don't have time to think. Everyone's just rushing around, don't you think? I mean, society is pressing everyone to, you need to get there faster.
Yeah, and at the same time, we're supposed to have a well-informed electorate. We're supposed to have elections. That is, people who are doing this all the time, they also get to vote.
That's right, that's right. And so what do you think about the 2 major political candidates for president? So is Hillary Clinton neocon light, and is Donald Trump a traditional American, or is he a fraud?
What I find the most interesting about the current presidential campaign is that you have full rebellions in both parties.
Okay.
And isn't it interesting that Bernie Sanders' issues, or about 65% of his issues, are about the same as Trump's issues.
Right.
Now,
I mean, trade.
Right. What they will want to do to address the problems separates them. But they're bringing up the same issues. And I don't think that 1 person out of 10 among Bernie Sanders supporters have the foggiest idea what socialism is.
Yes.
They may have heard the word, but do they know anything about it?
No.
And the ones who are supporting Trump, they hear certain things. I'm going to build a beautiful wall.
That's right. And then he says it's just a suggestion. I'm not going to really do it. I mean,
well, be that as it may, he is sending a message, and people are picking up on it, just as the people behind Sanders are picking up on these things. Something's got to give. And at that particular time, what happens? Well, the political establishment and journalistic establishment, they are mighty upset.
Yes.
Imagine questioning our right to rule.
That's right. What is your view about migrants streaming into the United States and into Europe? I mean, does the UN have a role to play here, do you think?
I doubt it. If America can't handle its own problems, you don't turn to the UN to do it.
Okay, so somehow the United States has got to handle their immigration problem, right?
Well, it's an acute problem.
It is.
I go to McDonald's all the time, and I find most of the people who get me my food charming, delightful people. But the question is, how does a country maintain some of its own traditions, the traditions on which constitutionalism depends? Now, it's not as simple as to say that because you have a huge influx of Latinos, we're turning into a banana republic. That's not my point at all. But at the very time when America is weakening, when constitutionalism is crumbling, may not be the right time to have a tremendous influx of migrants. You can't absorb them.
Okay.
You're having difficulty holding your country together as it is, so even without this challenge.
So you like the idea of a moratorium on immigration for a while?
Well, exactly how that is to be handled is something for people who understand what they're talking about to deal with.
Well, you know, the other thing is the United States can't even deport illegal immigrants. I read that some 20,000 illegal immigrants have been convicted of 64,000 crimes, including assault, kidnapping, and murder, and they're still here. I mean, it's a huge problem, isn't it?
It's a problem and very difficult to deal with, partly because, as they say, the Republicans want cheap labor. The more the better.
Yes.
And the Democrats want more voters. So how do you address a problem like that? It's politically very tricky. But it's interesting that when Trump makes that a central issue, he gets real forward momentum. I take that to mean that people out there, Joe Sixpack guys, they know that this is a serious problem and it's a threat to them.
Yeah, and their families.
Rightly or wrongly, that's how they perceive it.
How do military invasions help the American people? I mean, and when will they end? How do they help?
Well, if the American national interest is threatened in some way, you can make a legitimate argument for using force. But if it is not involved, then the burden is on you to say that this is mandatory. And I suppose that you would normally do what neoconservatives and humanitarian interventionists have said, namely that we have to do the noble and right thing. We have to help them to acquire democracy or freedom or something like this. And it's on that kind of logic that the U.S. has intervened repeatedly in the Middle East. And the Middle East, as you know, is a complete shambles.
It is chaotic.
It's made in America.
Made in America, exactly right. Well, what do you think about the objectivity of the American press? I mean, it seems to me that if Charles Krauthammer or George Will or Sean Hannity say something positive about President Obama, it would be akin to a rock and roll radio station playing classical music. I mean, they would not be playing to their audience. I mean, what do you think about our free press?
Well, for a very, very long time, the press in the United States, as in Europe, has reflected the intellectual and cultural trends of the elites.
Yes.
The trend has been leftward, radical, in the universities. And the so-called name universities tend to set the tone. And so over time, you get a momentum in that direction. And that is why it is almost rare for journalists to favor so-called conservative politicians,
yes,
or even just Republicans.
right.
Republicans are a small minority.
And
So this reflects the general trend of our Western culture. And the reason the Republicans or the so-called conservatives are still alive is that you have a lot of people out there who haven't caught on yet.
exactly. Well, your symposium contains a number of philosophical references. I mean, who are your favorite philosophers?
Well, how long do we have?
We have,
I certainly would mention among the classical writers Aristotle. If you go forward, I would point to the English statesman thinker Edmund Burke, and there's a great American who is unfortunately somewhat ignored by the name of Irving Babbitt. There's an Italian whom I really like, although I have reservations, by the name of Benedetto Croce.
Okay. Well, and how about the fact that Machiavellian view was targeted in your book about the fact that violence can be appropriate in times of moral disintegration and desperation. I was really surprised to read that in your book.
Well, I
journal.
offer a partial defense of Machiavelli.
Okay.
Moralistic thinkers in the Western world have always disdained Machiavelli because he believes that in certain really fraught, difficult circumstances, the statesman has no choice but to deal harshly with opposition. You're trying to create order where there is none.
Okay.
Now, something that's unfortunate about Machiavelli is that he explains why that is necessary by saying that sometimes you have to make an exception to morality. Do bad things for the sake of a good end. I disagree with him about that. If something is truly necessary to achieve a good objective, there's no reason it should be called immoral.
That's very interesting. Well, we are unfortunately coming to an end here, so where can our viewers find your journal on the web?
Humanitas is published by the National Humanities Institute, and you find it on the web by going to NHINET.org. Or go to Google and just put in Humanitas.
Wonderful. Well, Professor Rand, thank you so much for being on the Bookman's Corner. It's really been enlightening and interesting to be with you today.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you so much for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.